While of course I will talk about NAM, but if you look at this Venn diagram, this in a sense is the structure of my talk, but this is also the way I see agricultural marketing as a subset of a larger political economy of agriculture, which itself is a larger part of the political economy of development. And of course, we have the overarching constitutional framework, which I will not talk about, but the way I propose to lay out my argument before you is to briefly touch upon the larger political economy of development, which in my experience, which is of course centered in Madhya Pradesh and also at the national level. I also had the privilege to work for 5 years in the UN in IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development. So I saw some very interesting parallels, especially in Latin America and Africa. So those are the experiences which are informing these, shall I say, some conclusions, which of course are debatable, which I hope will be challenged by some of you. But this is my understanding, and as Smriti so kindly introduced me, half my career of 34 years I have spent in agriculture, okay, out of reasons of choice. So people sometimes ask me, so what, something went wrong? But I assure you that it was out of series of accidents that I ended up there, but then I didn't want to get out of that sector. So I'll very briefly first lay out some larger, shall we say, framework of the political economy of development, and then we'll come to how agriculture gets influenced by that. There are largely three broad streams, or shall we say two broad streams, on how India's political economy of development has been studied in the last 30 odd years. Pranab Bardhan at Berkeley is one of the foremost scholars. His basic argument is that at the time of independence, India achieved a great political revolution, but not a social revolution, and that's, I think, known to all of us. Unlike Western democracies, which went through a period of gradual democratic reform and then achieved full democratization, India, in a sense, was largely an agrarian feudal economy in 1947, but it acquired some of the most modern institutions of democracy. And this he places at the root of the conflict, or the, shall we say, tensions that India underwent. So his basic thesis is that the three dominant classes, which is the rich industrialists, the old landed gentry, and the new class of professionals, they engaged in what he calls an alliance of domination. Okay? None of the three groups by themselves are powerful enough to impose their sole agenda on the country. So they have to interact with each other. There is contestation, but there is also compromise. But the outcome of this compromise is that there are always suboptimal choices made when it comes to the policy formulation. So one central, shall we say, feature of this relationship of mutually antithetical but forced cohabitors is, that each of the classes, whether it's the old landed class, the industrial class, or the new professional class, it seeks to enhance rents on its assets. So obviously, landed classes will try to protect its interest in land and enhance rents through land. The industrial classes will try to enhance rents from capital. And what about this new professional class? What is its asset? Its asset is office. Okay? So it seeks to enhance rents on the office it holds, and the professional classes includes the bureaucracy at all levels, the politicians, and other similar professionals. So some of the major outcomes which you see, which are the compromises of this situation, you accept a kind of capitalist development in a quote unquote mixed economy mode, a new term which economists had not heard of when India adopted it, where neither the industrial classes nor the landowning classes are able to fully exploit the potential of their assets, but they sort of muddle along. There is also the incomplete set of land reforms that you see. So you allow a certain sort of say excess to be reduced, but you don't really go whole hog after land reforms except in some parts of the country. In the case of labor, you follow restrictive policies which neither free up labor nor are the benefits, let's say, of modern labor practices available to them. So it's an economy of compromise where each of these three coexist with each other, but it leads to suboptimal policy choices. That's one view. This view is largely supported by Kaviraj, who's the other big scholar on India's political economy. And he also challenged, some people call this 1947 revolution the passive revolution, that India did not see the kind of violent revolution that France or Russia or China, which overthrew the old order and in a sense established a new society. So we in a sense inherited our social order, but there was a passive revolution through this new democratic sort of urge. In Kaviraj's view, the state identified the reproduction of capital as one of its key functions. And that's what leads to this whole need to control the bureaucracy at all levels. So from the beginning, there is this great tussle between the center and the states as to who shall control the All India services. To what extent will the center, after having recruited on the so-called merit principle the elite services and making them available to the states, allow the states to control them? And if you read some of the debates in the Constituent Assembly, there's a very fascinating tussle which is going on with the states obviously wanting greater control and the center wanting to use the centralized bureaucracy as a tool to push its agenda, primarily the reproduction of capital through this mechanism. Now, this is not to say that this is a static situation. Even the sort of compromised outcomes lead to some long-term changes. And if you look at a 60, 70 year record, you have, of course, weakening of some of these older structures. Definitely in parts of the country, the older feudal landed elite has weakened, especially in the new, in the Green Revolution here, you have new landed groups which have come to the fore. All the old industrial families, except a few, are now very weakened. New entrepreneurial classes have managed to take advantage. Some of these entrepreneurs have also used the rent-seeking behavior of political and administrative classes to push their agenda. People, have recorded this, I think, in great measure. And please bear with me for another minute because I'm putting this larger context because in my argument, the larger political economy of development that India has experienced is very relevant to how it plays out in agriculture. And I'll hopefully in the end, give you this theory of everything which connects everything here. Partha Chatterjee, another scholar who looked at bureaucratic functioning, especially in central Indian states, and he wanted to explore why there is this big gap between the policy, which can be sometimes very enlightened, and the practice, which can be, extremely skewed. So he comes up with this idea of the outer domain of rules and an inner domain of culture. So in Partha Chatterjee's view, all these merit-based elite bureaucracies which are recruited, the IAS, the IPS and other such services, they form this outer domain of formal rules. But when it gets down to the ground, the local bureaucracy may be more sympathetic to, let's say, the prevailing culture of a particular region, which could be, let's say, I worked in Madhya Pradesh for more than 20 years of my 3-decade career. And I can honestly say that it would be one state, even more so, though Rajasthan is considered more feudal, but I would say that the kind of feudal tendencies that we experienced in Madhya Pradesh would in some cases be perhaps more rigid than even Rajasthan and certainly parts of UP, which I would say actually have responded to change and have actually allowed marginalized groups to come to power in a far more successful manner. Okay, so this makes our institutions very porous, and so instead of rule-based functioning, these institutions are more akin to the old patron-client sort of relationships which existed, let's say, in our rural context in large parts of the country. All right. So now this is the larger political economic context, which brings me to agriculture per se, and I will come to markets after I give a little explanation of this. So I'm talking with greater relevance, let's say, to central and eastern India. This may not necessarily be equally relevant in parts of the south or western India, which I would say have liberalized their economy and they have gone down a different pathway. But certainly in most of the central Indian states, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, also to a great extent Orissa, we would perhaps be able to see a situation like this. So if you just look at the screen, I'm using this Venn diagram to show the context in which the farmer here represents agriculture. Caste is still very strong. I'll explain each of these in the next slide. You have on two sides rural commercial capital and modern commercial capital trying to make inroads, and you have the basic factor markets, land, labor and capital. So what I'm suggesting in this diagram is that the farmer is in a sense equally participating in many of these institutional relationships, and of course these factors also, the arrows suggest that they are also interacting among themselves. In the next slide I'll try and do this a little better. So I've selected three major features of each of these four big, I would say, forces in the agriculture political economy. Now again I'm generalizing, but I'm generalizing for a region. I'm not suggesting this is true for the entire country, especially not perhaps for the south and west. But if you look at the first pillar, which is the factor markets, and I'm using land, labor and technology as the three factors in agriculture here. This is a region where land reforms were largely subverted. Okay? Yes, zamindaris were abolished, but people very successfully were able, please refer to Partha Chatterjee's argument about the porous nature of institutions. They were very successfully able to subvert the lower level bureaucracies to, shall we say, bypass all the positive elements of the land reform legislation, and by around the mid 70s to 80s, political will to push this had more or less been exhausted. Now, along with the abolition of zamindaris, most of these states also abolished tenancies, right? And except for Haryana and Punjab in the north and Telangana in the south, no other state formally allows tenancy in agriculture. But the fact is, as NSS data repeatedly points out, the latest situation survey in agriculture in 2013 again brought out, more than 80% of small and marginal farmers have to lease in land, obviously because their own asset size is very small. So you currently have a situation, especially in these central and eastern states, where around 85% of the households are categorized as small and marginal, but together they own only around 40% of the land. You also have the phenomenon of very poor state of land records. Of course, because of social causes, fragmentation is increasingly taking place. There is no incentive for consolidation, and rural property markets are essentially frozen. Okay? There is no clear authority which can declare title, so people will not get into transactions because it can lead to huge amount of litigation, and you may not end up owning the asset that you paid for. In labor, we have traditionally discouraged mobility. Migration politically is a very risky concept. So we've encouraged policies which tend to keep labor in situ. NREGA being the latest example, but there is a whole history of food for work programs and other rural wage programs which tended to keep labor in situ. Of course, it's true that since the early part of this century, because of rapid urbanization and the growth of some other service industries, there has been transfer of labor. But as a policy, especially in central and eastern India, labor mobility was discouraged. And that was complemented by the low importance given to mechanization in agriculture. So it becomes a vicious cycle. Small plots, low priority mechanization, overpopulated regions, and poor returns on agriculture. The technological divide between the better endowed and the poor endowed regions today is as much as the digital divide. Okay? If you look at the rain-fed regions, which largely are around the middle of the country, starting from Gujarat right up to Orissa, and you look at the Indo-Gangetic belt, the gap in productivity can be as much as 50%. And it's not because of the non-availability of technologies. Technologies are on the shelf, but the social and other institutional constraints are combining to prevent the penetration of this technology to, let's say, the people who need it most. In the second pillar, I'm talking about the second factor in the agriculture political economy, which is what I call rural commercial capital. The term, of course, was coined by Barbara Harris White, the Cambridge economist who looked at the rice markets of Burdwan in West Bengal for over 30 years. And RCC basically is anything like, could be the old landowner, the mandi trader, the local small and medium enterprise like a oil mill or a dal mill. Now, the rural credit market is essentially dominated by the rural commercial capital today. Okay? Modern financial capital, which is in the next pillar, has not been able to make significant headway or penetration. In fact, the last situational survey says only 40% farmers reported access to institutional finance in agriculture, and of which small marginal farmers are only 15%. So if around 85% of farmers are accessing informal credit at rates that begin at about 36%, I don't think we can identify an agricultural activity which can service this kind of a loan and yet leave him with a surplus. So tight credit for agriculture becomes the instrument with which RCC is able to dominate and control agriculture. And to protect its position, of course, it buys political patronage, it supports electoral politics at the local level, and I will refer to this again when I talk about agriculture markets and the attempts at reform, because any attempt at opening up agriculture markets is basically a confrontation with rural commercial capital. In the third pillar, where I've mentioned about the modern financial capital, government in its own, I would say, halting way, in a sense, tried three major attempts to push back RCC. So the first wave was the cooperative movement, which in its time, and sir, perhaps you were in the field at that time, it was a revolutionary idea that you can have a member-owned institution which would tap into rural savings, which would advance credit, which will arrange inputs. But the history is quite well known, so I need not repeat it. The old Partha Chatterjee inner domain of culture prevailed in a couple of decades to capture the whole cooperative movement and to steer it away from its democratic principles. Bank nationalization was a second wave where the government tried to push in modern capital into the rural hinterland. Lots of new branches were opened, but I think there was a very poor understanding of costs and returns at that time, and I think that was a very sorry end to that experiment. By the time 1991 came, in fact, that wave had to retreat. Hundreds of rural branches ended up being closed down, and so that also proved to be a non-starter. In the 90s, microfinance for a while seemed to be an answer, at least in some pockets of the country, but there again, it more or less, I think, did not deliver on its promise. One unknown factor which I would say has played a positive role is globalization of some agricultural commodities. So cotton, and in a state like Madhya Pradesh, soybean, ended up being, I would say, an inadvertent modernizer, in the sense that these value chains were controlled outside the country. Prices of the basic agricultural commodities, which got influenced by these global trends, initially disturbed the status quo. Many of the older players in the mandis had to adapt their practices around. There's a very interesting PhD thesis which a lady called Mekhla Krishnamurthy, who's currently teaching at the Shiv Nadar University. So In 2006, when I was in Madhya Pradesh as Secretary Agriculture, she turned up through somebody's reference, and she said that I want to, she was basically studying, she was basically a student of social anthropology, and she studied the Harda Mandi. She in fact done a wonderful ethnography, which is soon to be published. And she's looked at how a commodity like soybean ended up disturbing the traditional power relation. It's a micro study, but very interesting. However, in conclusion, one has to say that MFC has certainly not made a significant dent alongside with instruments like WHR or futures trading. The so-called great promise of Jan Dhan is yet to be delivered, but I've just put it up there. Perhaps it's the next wave of the government's attempt to try and weaken some of the hold of RCC. Caste is the usual suspect that people talk about, and I put it here because certainly in central and eastern India, it is still the major, I would say, instrument of your bargaining power. Okay, even asset ownership comes secondary to your caste status, and I think we should not belittle or underestimate its influence. One positive development that took place certainly in the last 20-25 years was the rise of marginalized groups, especially in UP, Bihar, and some other parts of north and central India, to political power. But what is a little disappointing is that these groups, when they come to power, they do not seem to align with, shall we say, modern practices. They tend to fall back on the prevailing mores of interinstitutional behavior. So there are any amount of good, I think, case studies on this. I don't have to name anybody, but I think we all are aware that the political empowerment of erstwhile socially unempowered groups has not necessarily led to more liberalization, especially not in agriculture. And so I'm just leaving it here for the time being, and I hope when I talk about marketing per se, so I'll now come to the specific context of agriculture marketing before I talk about NAM. And I'll try and finish in the next 10 minutes because I want such a distinguished group to perhaps throw out some counter or even some new insights on this. So these are a few conclusions you could say based on what I've been saying so far. One is, and I think I have a senior colleague here from UP with a lot of far more experience than me. He would agree with me here. Unlike, let's say, the kind of reforms that we've seen in industry and services, there has not been a parallel, shall I say, scale of reform in agriculture, because the key stakeholders in the agriculture economy, which I described in the earlier slide, are not inclined to loosen up because they see it as a direct dilution or even a loss of power. That's my first argument here. But I'm also saying that this growing disconnect, so today agriculture is perhaps the most unreformed part of our economy, and some parts of our country, if you go there, you would find it difficult to believe that you're actually in the 21st century. Whether you're looking at the physical infrastructure, you're looking at the behavior of the market agents or the sellers, we could be in a medieval sort of setting. Okay, and it's quite surprising given the fact that in most other parts of the economy, the penetration of modern institutional principles has been quite successful. So this disconnect between the larger movement of the economy towards market principles and this resistance in the agriculture economy, I would say, is the root cause of the frequent crises that we see in agriculture. At the worst, it is shall I say, it's played out in the form of the hundreds, if not thousands of suicides of farmers. Because these farmers have got into commercialization of agriculture without being able to address all the attendant risks. Marathwada, Vidarbha, even parts of Andhra, certainly parts of Madhya Pradesh, where of course which is luckier because it is far better endowed in terms of water. So if you've not heard of the same scale of farmer distress in Madhya Pradesh, it's largely because of a positive land-man ratio and a much greater availability of water. But Marathwada, where I have traveled extensively in all those districts, when I was in the Ministry of Agriculture, you can see how people have been led to change from which were largely subsistence crops like pulses or jowar into value chains like cotton, which are linked to global forces which they don't understand. There is no coverage of risk. There is very poor penetration of insurance. Most of these people are not linked to institutional credit, etc., etc. So the basic point I'm trying to make is that this disconnect, rather the larger unreformed state of agriculture, is at the root cause of the frequent crisis that we are witnessing. Now, what does the government do? The government seems to have focused on agriculture marketing as the one wheel of this multi-axled, multi-wheeled vehicle, which if it were somehow able to change, it would make the vehicle perform in a more efficient manner. But of course, because reform in this country has great political risk, so this reform is also done by stealth, episodically, and in isolation of the larger political economy context of agriculture. And I'll relate this to NAM when I come to the NAM issue. But I mean, we of course are great believers in the theory of Indian exceptionalism, but there is something like a global experience, and globally, including most recently in China, without addressing reform in the basic factor markets, no country has been able to achieve agriculture market reform. And it's very unlikely that it's going to be different in India. Whether it is e-commerce or whether it is NAM, seeing it as a one-off, and I'm sorry to be pushing my sort of brand, but I would invite you to read my little column in the Express, which I write fortnightly on the rural page, where today I made the same argument, that looking at agriculture reform as mere agriculture marketing reform frequently has led us down nowhere. And NAM will be no different in my little experience, and I'll explain to you how the whole DNA of NAM has been compromised from the very beginning, because we could not overcome or we could not confront this larger political economy of agriculture. Okay, so I'll now talk about NAM. I'm sorry, I've gone the reverse way. I was supposed to talk about NAM, but without talking about all that I have, I don't think I could have come to this slide. So as a goal, there is nothing, I think, contestable about creating a unified national agriculture market, evening out, and it's very much akin to what GST is trying to do for taxes. NAM was trying to attempt for the basic agricultural commodities. But it's trying to do it in a way, as I said, bypassing all the difficult knots that lie along the way. So NAM was initially conceived as an online portal, okay, where sellers could post their product and buyers could bid, and there would be some sort of agency in between which would effect settlements. I mean, it's almost fanciful, and we have a major exchange and we have a regulator sitting here, and I'm very much looking forward to their comments on this. So this was the, let's say, Maximus sort of model that was initially discussed. When the states were called for consultation, they said, well, you can go ahead and do what you want with it, but physically the goods have to move out of my market area, right? So the way the APMCs work is that every APMC has a jurisdiction, and in the jurisdiction of that APMC, any agricultural product which is to be sold or traded has to be brought to that regulated market yard in a physical sense. Some states now allow bulk buyers to pick up the product from the farmer's field, but that trade has to be reported to the mandi, and whether or not the physical premises have been used, the mandi cess has to be paid. And this was challenged years ago and upheld even by the Honorable Supreme Court, that yes, the APMC legislation allows this person, whether or not his facilities have been used, to charge a cess on any trade taking place in his jurisdiction. So people have given up on hoping to do away with this, what many people call an unnecessary cess or a cost or a transaction fee, which perhaps is not justified. Anyway, so the state said the NAM can exist in the virtual world, but when the commodity physically moves out of my market area, a cess will have to be paid, and we'll have to have a mechanism to track that. Okay, so when the states came up, and the majority of the states said this, of course, we are leaving out states like the Northeast which don't have APMC legislation, but where the tradable surplus is negligible. So the compromise solution that was found was that, okay, NAM exists in the virtual sphere, but the APMC is the physical manifestation at the back end. So a unique hybrid model, again tried nowhere else in the world, but as I said, the larger political economy dictated that it had to be accepted. The APMCs would be made stakeholders in NAM by being made the physical platform in which the product would be brought. The NAM portal would be available in that mandi. Buyers registered on NAM would be available online. The farmer would have the choice to invite bids from the local physical traders, or if an online trader is interested in that lot, then the online bidder can also bid. The farmer will have the choice to either sell it locally or to the online bidder. This was the sweetener which enabled at least the states to come on board. 23 states did sign up and said, okay, fine, we are okay with this model, but we'll choose the mandis. And Government of India said, we will create the software and we will make it available free of cost to those mandis. All the customization charges in the local language and to conform to your local mandi legislation also will be borne by us. Some money was also given to the mandis for infrastructure, computers, terminals and all that. Okay. But the point I'm trying to make is, in a sense, what we did is we embedded the DNA of the physical mandis back into the NAM. Okay. In an ideal world, the NAM should have been a parallel or should have been a challenger to the physical mandi. Instead, the NAM has been made a captive of the physical mandi. So, in the first year of NAM, this was the first calendar year of NAM because the whole process took till the end of December. I left in late November, but we had by the time put out the tenders and all that. And the rollout plan was that by Kharif marketing season 2016, which is right upon us now, another month and a half, 200 mandis would have the NAM software embedded and trade would start at least in a few commodities. As of the latest information, 23 mandis have the software. Not a single trade has taken place so far. Not a single trade has taken place on NAM so far. Gujarat has totally rejected the software and said this software is not workable with our software. So we'll make our own software to plug back in. So they want to opt out for a year of the whole mandi. Tamil Nadu has never come online. Andhra has never come online. So there are major states. Maharashtra has never come online. So these three major agricultural states. Punjab has not come online because Punjab said we will not reduce our market shares from 14%. So one of the, and we will not allow traders from outside to be registered by NAM. They'll have to register with us. So there are these, so the whole political economy is playing out in a way to, in a sense, squeeze the life out of NAM. I thought, and of course I'm as much of an outsider to government now as the rest of you, except of course we have a regulator, so he's in a different zone. But I thought when the Prime Minister put his prestige behind the launch of this, and he actually launched on the 14th of August, I thought now we'll actually see some momentum. But it's, I think, quite disappointing that we have just seen no traction of NAM. Okay? So I call it passive resistance. I talked about the passive revolution, but this is real passive resistance, and the Gandhian state is leading in the passive resistance. There are also, I would say, confusing signals coming out of different arms of GOI. Right? On the one hand, you want NAM, which will integrate all commodity trading on one platform. On the other hand, you are, like target practice, one by one, advising the states to take off various categories of commodities off the mandi platform. So if we have accepted that mandis are an essential part of NAM, then what logic is it for the Consumer Affairs Ministry to have issued a directive last week that states should take pulses of the mandi platform? Now, are we implicitly accepting that the trading of pulses in the APMCs is non-transparent, it is leading to additional transaction costs? At least the logic should be explained. But there's a one-off line saying the state should delist pulses. Earlier, the move was to delist fruits and vegetables, which again I argue is an example of this episodic, sporadic reform, which is not likely to lead us into any happy situation. There is an option available to Government of India, which is the trade list. Now, agriculture and agriculture marketing, of course, is a state subject. So the Government of India cannot legislate to impose a certain model on the states. But there is a trade entry in the union list, which is an exclusive central function. And in the name of trade, the Government of India could legislate, not necessarily, I would say, making anything which is happening in the APMCs illegal, but the trade function would override many of the current provisions of the APMCs. This is something that never went beyond discussion. It was never even reduced to a paper. When the NAM was being designed, this was one of the first ideas. Since I was in SFAC, it was given the role of coming up with the model. So this is the option that we first wanted to push, but we were advised that this is just a non-starter, so you go for the best compromise solution on the design. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm just going to make this last comment that the experience with NAM, as also the experience with other sporadic episodic reform in agriculture marketing, just underscores the point of view that without looking at the larger ecosystem reform in agriculture, especially the reform of the basic factor markets, we are not going to be able to achieve the kind of unified market for agricultural products that we want to see in this country. Thank you so much for your attention.